Hello and welcome to Coach Talk, the show more interested in ideas and philosophy than facts and history. Now, before I get into introducing my guest this week, I have a special announcement, and that is I've started working with Coachify, and as part of that, they're sponsoring this podcast. So for those who don't know, Coachify.gg is a website that creates tools to help coaches be more efficient. Now, they primarily have been focused on tools for coaching in solo queue, but they're just now moving into working with teams and building up a lot of tools that team coaches can use to keep track of goals. They integrate with the API of the game, so it automatically tracks certain things. You can do VOD reviews there and more things to come. Now, if you're anything like me, you're very used to using, at best, Google Docs. Sometimes it was a pretty Google Docs if it was set up by an analyst. But that was because back then there wasn't that many tools available. But now coaching is so competitive in Europe, anything that we can do to set ourselves apart is really, really invaluable time. So if you want to check out Coachify, you can use the link below. Most of the tools that they have are available for free, although they do have some premium options. I'd recommend checking out the free ones first, seeing what you think and exploring what you can get from the premium. But for a lot of people, I think actually just the free ones will be invaluable. If you do this, please drop me a message on Discord or Twitter because I really want to hear what you've thought about it, what you think could be improved, what you would like to see that integrates into your workflow really much better, because we all work, of course, very, very differently. Now, on to my guest this week. My guest this week is Matthew Watson. He has both a practical and academic background, which gives him a very interesting perspective on a lot of the problems that we have in coaching in esports. Now, from an academic side, he's the Director of Learning and Development at IFoEC. He's co-authored a number of papers on esports performance practices, and he helped put together the first esports performance summit just a few months ago. From the practical side of things, he's the performance lead at Akolyte Esports. They're a group who help esports teams, including having helped last year people like G2. Now, it was a very interesting discussion this week. We talked about the dangers and opportunities of AI. We talked about the constraints-led approach and how you could be more efficient with your scrimming. And we also talked about his paper, Perceptions of Effective Training Practices in League of Legends. If you like this episode, please like, share, subscribe, do all those kind of things. And if you want to get involved or ask future guests questions, check out the links below to explore my Discord or Twitter. And now, without further ado, Watson, what is coaching?
Oof. So, and I apologize in advance for the probably academic approach to this question, but I would suggest that coaching at an abstract general level would be providing training and support to an individual or team towards a goal that, to achieve that goal, there is a certain level of performance that is required that is constrained by time and other rules in the form of competition. So supporting improvement in performers towards a goal that is constrained within a competition. I'd say that's very high level, very abstract what coaching is. Coaching in a competitive context. So to take it away from executive coaching or life coaching. That's probably where I'd start.
Okay. And how then would it be different from teaching?
So teaching, I think there I would go into the world of the professional, so the role and how the role differs. So there are similarities, I would say, between the process, but I think the role is inherently different. So certainly coaching involves elements of teaching at some level, probably at all levels, but certainly at maybe recreational to more amateur levels or early stage of development. I think the coaching, you want people to be on the same page with certain things. So maybe with certain skills, certain strategy, and that might require some teaching. And likewise, in a classroom, I mean, for its sins, generally you want students to attain a certain proficiency in something, but you want all of them to achieve that. So you're teaching to a level where everyone is going to be on that level. And coaching, I think, involves elements of that. However, the further into it you go, I think the less coaching looks like teaching, because a teacher requires, you could imagine everyone's in their own lane and everyone has a finish line. Coaching is like everyone starts in their own lane, but there are only so many finishing lines. So if you're, for example, working with a team in a sport like basketball and you have 12 players, only 5 can play. So not all of them have a finish line that is, I'm starting the game. So there is some selection there, which introduces elements that are not present in the world of teaching. So a teacher would be delighted, I think, if 100% of their students graduated with a pass in a certain assessment. The coach could have that, but then they have the problem of who, you've performed exceedingly well in my training, in the training we've put together. How do I then determine who plays in the game? And that's where it goes beyond just what's taught. It goes into relationships, and certainly the social side of things. It goes into understanding of needs and the dynamic changes in an individual's needs, and whether the coach is able to read that appropriately and understand it appropriately. And then does the coach themselves have strategic knowledge to make sense of those needs and fit it all together in that performance? So I think, similarities, but there are differences in the context, perhaps.
And coaching maybe is more supportive and less, I don't know, vertical or top-down sort of thing.
Very true. Yeah, I think it certainly could be. And my working definition of coaching, which there's a phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm very aware that I am doing that increasingly, but a working definition that I lean on would be that sort of coaching is, well, 2 parts to it. Coaching is an act of care. So I care to some degree about my players. I care about my role. So I therefore invest effort into it. But the care for players extends beyond them as players. It extends to them as people. Bit of a cliche term, but certainly I think that's true even at a very logical, dry level, where you will be doing a disservice to your players if you only focus on them as players. So if you know that a player is struggling outside of the team environment and you pay no attention to this, I'm not even saying going the extra mile to sort of check in with them and find them support, maybe a referral to a sport and exercise psychologist or something. If you're just not mindful of these players have lives outside of it, and if you are demanding a high level of them in terms of training load, like you're demanding that they show up 5 times a week for 6-7 hours, but you know that something's going on and you're not flexible to that, then I would say you're doing a disservice to your players. You're a pretty poor coach. So yeah, I think that there is an extension beyond just the playing, and you have to be aware of those broader needs. And maybe the teacher has kind of the luxury of, I can just see what is brought to me on a day-to-day basis to my classroom, because I think good teachers certainly are mindful of what's going on, and schools are probably very, on the whole, I'd say quite developed with the broader support they offer, because they probably have a whole department for sort of needs and further support for individual learners. There probably isn't so much that in most sports teams, certainly in most esports teams. So maybe the coach has to bear the brunt of that a bit more. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I love having these conversations, because it just like sparks so many different ideas in my head. But it's almost like we're very comfortable realizing that there's some element of teaching in coaching. But now, just with what you've said, thinking back over the teachers in my life who had the biggest impact, it was mostly because they're introducing aspects of coaching into their teaching, where it was more individualized and they did know things about me as a person that meant that they could change this part of the lesson or this part of the work to be better for me rather than to just be better for like the group. And they did care about me as an individual. So it's like that actually, yeah, I think my favorite teachers looking back now are all doing a bit of coaching as well.
Amazing to hear. Yeah. I can resonate with that. I mean, good examples of even the teacher that has the throwaway comment at the end of a lesson, good luck in the school basketball game tonight. Like, that's nice. It's touching. It feels like there's some care there. So yeah, good point. I hadn't even thought of it that way.
One of the things, as you were talking, you were mentioning, people having different finish lines. I like that as a phrase, and mentioning substitutes. So basketball coach working with 10 players or stuff like that. That leads me on. Normally I would get to the questions from Discord a bit later, but it leads me on to a really good question from my Discord, which again, I'm going to shamelessly plug. Join my Discord if you want to ask questions to people on Coach Talk and get involved in the discussion. But the question is, to what extent is it beneficial to have substitutes to put pressure on a starting lineup to perform? Now, first we'll start in general. You've obviously got a lot of experience outside of esports as well. We can start in general, and then we can also come on to esports in a bit.
Yeah. So in sport, I don't think it's questioned in any way as a negative beyond sort of making the squad. The selection pressure on making a squad. You often see it sort of elite level Olympic teams, for example. The selection deselection pressure is immense, but I don't think there's much thought that it's bad to have a playing squad that's greater than the team, because it does foster. I think the common idea is that it fosters like a healthy competition. It ensures that there is an incentive to perform during training sessions. So largely probably quite good. And I think in sports teams, I think for the coach, it's quite exciting that next person up, next player up mentality. It's quite exciting to see what can be brought from the players that maybe are outside your initial strongest selection. So like what can be added from players that play a smaller part, for example. I think that's always quite exciting. So it's kind of like, it's a nice, if in the right dynamic, the player that is maybe getting less playing time in sport, you can see that maybe they're benefiting from playing with players that might be slightly better than them. So talent development, it's kind of nice. It kind of seems quite good. You can see that with in the right, and I use this term very, very lightly, but in the right culture, you can see that maybe the star player appreciates having a motivated backup to share some time with in terms of playing time. And yeah, in the right environments, I think having substitutes, having players that play a minor role in terms of actual playing time and contribution directly to performance, but maybe they can thrive in other ways. And we talk a lot about athlete leadership in sports psychology. So things like, is there a motivational leader? Is there a sort of a social leader in some sense? Is there someone that really represents the sort of prototype of the team to a high degree that really you can all lean on as sort of role model? That could be like the veteran player who sees playing time diminishing. Is that person really just someone for the aspiring or the superstars to look to as like a source of strength and maybe pride in the team? Those are all good things. Yet I think it's so difficult to work with a team beyond, if you've only got 5 playing spots and you've got a roster of 12. It's very difficult. I used to coach basketball to a reasonable level, and you'd always prefer to go to a game with 10 players because there's 5 playing spots and you could just swap in and out 1-to-1 and it wouldn't be too much of a headache. As soon as you go to 12 players, you've got an awkward substitution pattern where you want to give your best players arguably the lion's share of the time, but you go one substitution and then you get the problem with the 11th and 12th player coming in, and then you're slowly seeing the lion's share of the minutes decreasing for the players that perhaps should play the most for whatever reason. If it's a reward for turning up at training, or if it's just because that's the environment, the expectations are that the best players play to win the most. And then in esports, right, where it's not so much the done thing to carry a group of substitutes. And my understanding is that, or what I've experienced is that there is a downside to it in terms of training. I mean, you yourself, John, as a high level league coach, like the amount of effort that goes into arranging training. So finding a scrim partner, finding another team to play against that's of a reasonable level, that has the right motivation and intent on a given day to train effectively, like that's quite a lot of work. So carrying your own reserve team to play against, if you could find people of the right level, would be hugely advantageous to that. Does it introduce pressure on the players in a positive way? Potentially, except that presumably those reserve players would be in the team because they have achieved a certain rank in a certain game, and so they would be looking to play more so than not. And then you've got as a coach, you've got a very hard line to walk there between explaining on a weekly basis why these subs aren't having a shot in the official, because you wouldn't. I get the sense you wouldn't, especially in league, you wouldn't want to change the lineup every week, and you can't make subs during the game. So, yeah, maybe that's like the crux of it. Like, because you can't change the roster, carrying subs in esports would be tough because you just can't have players of really equal level, because the threat would just be too great, perhaps.
I mean, I think that a lot of times in esports, that it has been tried, many times, and I think that there's a lot of, the nicest way to phrase it would be a lot of execution error in all those attempts. And I say that being the person who made it happen one of the times. I wasn't unfortunately able to run it, but it was, my push to make it happen, and it didn't work at all. It was also a problem because it had to be across two different places. And we've seen most people try to do it with sort of sister teams, as in two different teams, and everyone gets an official game. But then there's rules from Riot about swapping people in and out with like your academy team and your main team and all that kind of thing. There's a few like positives that I would add on that before I get into the sort of playing devil's advocate part. But the first is, you mentioned like training and learning from the other players. And I do think that while I of course think coaches have a big impact, most of the learning that happens in a game like League of Legends especially is just from osmosis. It's just from playing with people who are better than you. You put a rookie AD carry with a great veteran support, they will learn more from just playing with that person than you will teach them. And they'll learn more from playing in LEC level scrims than they'll learn from playing in ERL level scrims. Partly because I think the coaching structures that we're doing are not the best, but also because there's just so many variables. And so actually playing the game and being in the game, I think, has a massive impact. And so in a way, having a 10-man squad, if you could do it right, would not only allow you to see, okay, I think this rookie, he's not maybe got it right now, but give him 4 months, 6 months playing and training at an LEC level, regardless of whether he's playing on stage at an LEC level. Maybe he gets there, maybe he doesn't get there. And we see so many rookies kind of come in and out, and especially because of the way people do recruitment, we see people almost have like one shot and then blow it by not doing well in like, they've got 5 games or 10 games or something, and there's like, no, not good enough, next. So I think this could be really, really helpful for that, which I think is great. In terms of the subbing people in, obviously, if you're playing best of ones, completely agree. I think as well, the old format, at least in the West, was very not conducive to this because there were just so few games. So, can you know anything about someone before you've seen 10 games in the LEC level? And if you only had 18 games in a season, you can't do that. Like it's just never going to work. Whereas now there's more games, if you do make it through. But the other thing that I've seen when it's been effective before is, for example, a few teams did sort of 6 or 7 man rosters with a jungler, for example, who's going to come in a best of 5. Happened very famously with SKT a few times, with Bengi coming in. And the advantage you get is you've done loads of prep to see how the enemy jungler paths normally. But of course, coming into this game, it might well change everything up. And yet you've seen game 1 and game 2. So you've seen from both sides where he did actually go and where he did actually prioritize. And as a jungler, changing that up during a best of 5 is much more difficult than changing it up in the week leading up to it. So you can sort of use that as well. So those are a couple of positives. But the other, like the big question that I would ask you from your sport point of view, isn't the main reason we have subs in sport due to the physical like stress of performance? People can't play a full match of basketball. It's incredibly fast. I mean, I think you even have rolling subs in basketball, right? Because it is just constantly so fast. Or if you take rugby, for example, I mean, I think under a certain age, you in the UK at least, you are like not legally allowed to play more than 80 minutes of competitive rugby. And so we always used to have a thing where if the second team was playing the day before the first team, some of our players would just have to be subbed off in case they had to be subbed on in the later games. So if in sport everyone had infinite energy and there was no chance of anyone getting injured, would teams really pay to have 12 players rather than 5? Wouldn't you just keep your 5 best players and that's it?
At the highest level, almost certainly, yeah. You'd much rather have Michael Jordan on the court for the whole game, Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, any of the biggest names. Like, they were dominant. You'd like to keep them on. There is an argument to be made for mixing up the strategy, I suppose. So, I mean, in football, you might have a player that's very good at set pieces, and maybe you notice that like the game's getting scrappy and the opportunities are there. So maybe you want a certain type of player on. So mixing up the strategy potentially. But yeah, I think physically you can't expect to give everything for the entirety of a game. So in most sports, I'd say it's most team sports, especially maybe team invasion game sports, even subcategory after subcategory. It is there is physical exertion, and giving your all is tough, very, very hard. So to sustain that over the entire game and make the right decisions at the crucial moments, it's likely not going to happen. Although we are seeing increasingly like the physical training is getting to the point where players are, I think one of the best basketball players in the world right now, Steph Curry, he talks about sort of training far harder than he plays, so that in the game situation, everything is lighter than it has been for the training load during the week. But I do think that's not common. And with the vast majority of involvement in team sport, it will be a push to sustain that 100% focus and decision-making across the whole game because of the physical side of it. You're right. In terms of esports, right? Yeah, of course, that's less obvious. So less obvious, I think I use that phrasing deliberately because I think the mental drain of playing several hours, so a scrim block of 5 games in League, I think more and more we're recognizing that 5th game is tough, very tough. Even if you've got all the motivation in the world to use it constructively if it's training or really play to a high level if it's performance, I think that 5th game is hard just because of the physiology of concentration. I think it's very tough to do that. So maybe there's an equivalent there, and a sub would be great. You know, if you could sub in a best of 5, if you could sub when it's 1-1 for that 3rd game, knowing that it's going to come back and you can bring back your star player for game 4, potentially game 5. But maybe, I don't know, I'm sort of spitballing there. But the former point as well about the academy setup, I think I would agree that they haven't really been executed perfectly. And my sense is, and please sense check me on this, my sense is that there isn't really, in comparison to sport, where there's very defined sort of levels of participation, so recreation to performance and developmental in the middle there. I feel like in esports, we've sort of bypassed developmental completely. And as soon as you step out of recreational, everything's performance. And so having an academy, it's like you're selling an academy spot on the basis that it's a springboard to the next level. So if you have a shot where you have an academy and you bring up a player for a game or for just a training experience, that player is then maybe a bit disgruntled about going back to the academy level. And I think that's very difficult because equally, if a player is a sub, they're missing out on a split where their stats appear on OPGG or LOL Pros or something like that, and it's career kind of a career backstep to be a sub because you're not seen, and that's I think that can also be part of the pressure. So I don't know. Is there a development?
I think that the way that academy teams have been run in the past, and as far as I can tell, continue to be run, is one of the sort of biggest mistakes that we've made in Europe for those exact reasons. I think that almost no team has a clear goal of what they're trying to do. And we're seeing exceptions of that in certain places, and those exceptions being absolutely massive. Mad Lions in the LEC this year, or KC have done this a lot, of just having like a really clear, this is what we're going to try to do. Now, if you take KC as an example, what they're trying to do is win everything, and what they have been doing, with extras, and they've done that really, really well. But we don't see teams who are, I would actually say, adult enough to recognize, look, if we're not going to commit this amount of resources, then our goal can't be to win. So what actually is our goal? And that comes from a performance point of view, where there are teams who their goal should be to make playoffs, but they have their goal as to make worlds, and therefore they miss out on playoffs. Or their goal should be to make worlds, and they are instead playing like they're trying to win, and therefore they miss out on worlds. I won't say the examples I've got in my head, but as a coach coming into the split, and maybe this isn't the role of the coach, but maybe it's the person one above the coach, head of LOL or anything like that. If previously in the LEC we've come like, I don't know, we've come to groups, or we've even missed out on groups, the goal for the next split is not to try and win. So don't try and beat G2. You have to target the games. You say, okay, right, we need 3 games, or we need 4 games to get through to the next round. So which 4 games are we going to put the effort into winning? Maybe you don't tell your players this, but you still see everyone preparing to beat G2 because it's great to beat the best. And that's fine if you're a volunteer, but like, we need to kind of grow up about things. So even from a performance point of view, I would say there's hardly any sort of adult and serious goals. But definitely from an organizational point of view, you see that a lot. And it was the same with kind of basically every academy. I mean, there was a few academies, like even actually Astralis Academy, for example, who focused on trying to find players even from their region and put together rosters of players who had potential. But a lot of teams are run with just, we're going to do the best that we possibly can with the money we decide to spend this year. And then next year we'll start again. And eventually, like, there's a phrase that actually that my dad talked about when we're looking at CVs. You have to be very careful with someone who's got 10 years of experience. Is it 10 years of experience, or is it 1 year 10 times?
Yeah, right.
And a lot of VRL teams have been here for 10 years, but they've been here for they do 1 year 10 times in a row, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And we don't see anyone, I think, really trying to develop talent. And you would have thought academies are absolutely great for that, and yet we saw academy teams, again, I won't use names, but they don't have academies anymore, which is very telling. But taking players who had played on their main roster just because it's like, well, these were the best roster that we could put together to do as well as we can in our competition. Yeah. And it's like, you've seen that over 2 years, this player in your environment hasn't got the level to step up to the next, to be in the LEC. So why do we have him in our academy? Yeah. Unless he's there to develop everyone else, which he was not. So if your academy is 4 out of 5 ex-LEC players, several of whom have played in your main team, then it just shows me like it's just not, it's not about that. But the problem is, and we're going on a bit of a rant, but the problem is that it can't be, in a way, because if you're the coach of that team, you're not judged on how many players you get promoted. You're judged on how well you do. And basically all players and all coaches who get promoted are people who are like top 4 EU Masters. So isn't actually the best thing to do to just focus on performance. And then the last point, which I was actually talking to Rhea, the coach of, well, was the head coach of KC, now the assistant coach, and he made the really good point is that it's also dependent on your region whether you can even do this. Because, for example, the LFL is like, it's obviously not got the same level as the LEC, but in terms of competitiveness of a 10-man league, I'm not sure you could get like mathematically more competitive. There was points where we were there where we were 8th and we were 2 games away from being 3rd and getting guaranteed EU Masters. So if you actually are focusing on development, you have a massive risk of getting demoted as an academy team in a league like that. And maybe it's just much easier if you happen to be a team from somewhere in the north and you can play in the NLC, where I feel like you can do both. But the whole system maybe isn't, I don't know if it's the whole system isn't set up for it or just we've misexecuted on the potential. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned to me before that there are teams like basketball teams, for example, or they have university teams. So they've got this feeder system, but they're university teams who focus on winning and they're university teams who focus on getting the most players in the NBA.
Yeah, I think I sympathise with all sides of the argument. That's kind of the chaos of it all, because it's not intuitive to be in a league and to set a goal that's not demolishing everyone and finishing first, right? It's not intuitive from a business perspective. Like, why would we not want to maximize our exposure by being the best? Like the business model, like it's not intuitive in terms of the high performance model. So we want to win, we want to prove ourselves, we want to show that our systems are better than their systems, our talent is better than their talent. And it's a problem across the board. Esports an elite sport. I think this emphasis on first place and the trophy, when there's a nice caveat to a definition of high performance in academic writing, where actually it doesn't really matter if you can be high performance by virtue of competing in an elite league. It doesn't mean that you are high performing. So not high performance, high performing. And that would be, high performing is a team that is doing well relative to their resources. So, if you've got all the money in the world and you're finishing second in the top league in the world, are you really high performance? Like, you had every opportunity to do everything the best way possible and finish above that. Likewise, if you're a team that is sort of penciled in as being automatic relegation team and you finish mid-table, you're arguably just performing above your means, right? And that's so worthy of credit and accolades that it takes a big philosophical shift in how you see the why we compete to really appreciate that. And I think there are clever things we could do better in esports. For example, like being together as a team is one way to sort of get sponsors and exposure and support the marketing campaign. But also, if you do develop players, that's a story to tell. And I think esports thrives on stories. And if you have a really good academy setup, should promote the team and their success. But I think there is a nice story to tell in, we discovered this player, we developed this player has thrived in our team. All right, we didn't get the wins, but individually doing very well. We can highlight other situations, interpersonal situations where they've thrived. We have nice game cons from this player. We can promote this individual success as well. But it kind of comes back to this. The coach has some role there, like you say, managing upwards. I forgive every org owner for saying, I don't want the coach that comes to me and says, look, we're not going to win. Like, the expectation is to do well, but to develop talent. I forgive every org owner for saying, okay, I don't want you to manage my roster. However, it would be just probably a refreshing shift to have some teams say, look, we're gunning to be a stable team here and to develop our identity, develop our playing identity, our org identity, to adhere to certain values, to give our players the best sense of care and well-being, to create the best stories and develop a fan base. Like, I think there's real merit in all of that, which I understand it sounds like an expression of from the get-go if you start with that. Very tough.
Yeah, I think it has to come from I mean, this is maybe a different point, but I think there's really a space for people in between the very top and the coaches who have an understanding of both, and it has to, I think, come from there. Whether that's, it would be a GM, I guess, in American sport. We have general managers in esports, but it's so team to team what they do. It's very, very unique roles, so I don't think you can say it should be on that person. But to someone to come in and have a clear vision and like long-term strategy, or strategical thinking, is just completely does not exist
Right.
in esports. I think one of the things that really always sticks out to me, I can't actually remember who said it. There's the High Performance podcast, which I'd highly recommend to everybody who's listening to this. You'll see a lot of inspiration, I'll say, with this one compared to that. But they open with the question, what is high performance? And I can't remember who it was. It might have been Phil Neville or someone. So maybe I'll try and find this and post it somewhere else. But when he was asked what is high performance, he said it's doing the best we can with what we've got where we are. That's
Bingo.
it. And now the problem is that everyone else that comes on this show, I'm like, well, he's already answered it.
It's wrong.
We've got the correct answer. Thank you.
But that is so nice. What a nice sentiment, because it means that even if you're competing in the lowest league on the planet, you can still be high performing, because maybe you only get opportunity to train twice a week, but you're smashing it in that official. That's great. You're high performing in some sense.
Yeah.
So,
or even if you're not competing, like you're just doing the best.
Yes.
In your job or in your role or even in your life with what you've got right now. That's such a good goal to be just aiming at and having there. It's also, just endlessly progressing. So I think it's a really, really good sentiment. I think one of the things that I've seen people say that we should do in esports is be a bit more open about salaries and having kind of public salaries. And I mean, I know there's reasons to not do this, but it would really tap onto one of the things that you said before, where, knowing some of the detail behind the scenes, I'm much more impressed with certain performances than maybe fans are. And it's like, look, if you're spending 5th out of 10 in the LEC and yet you've got the second most titles, that is amazing work. And if you're spending the most and you've not won, doesn't matter if you've come sort of 3rd or something. That's really not what you're aiming for. Not that it's necessarily terrible, because of course, with all this stuff, with all these goals, what happens on the day, it's why we love sport. But just because you're spending the most doesn't mean you're winning the most. But maybe you could almost kind of have clarity.
Yeah, you could imagine like an alternative league table with those metrics, and I could imagine like a huge fan base just following that league table. And of course, we like the winner of the winner outright gets their support isn't going anywhere. Like, people love to see the champions doing the best, but like that alternate relative to your salary, that would get a huge following.
Yeah, and also you would get to see what people are working with, and we'd have a much better judge of how good people are doing, or how maybe some people are struggling when it seems like from the outside they're doing really well. I mean, one of the things that was one of my favorite coaches is Dave Brailsford, who worked with British Cycling. And as he came in, there was also a huge injection of money from the National Lottery. And then when he came into like road race cycling with Sky, they also had the biggest budget. And that quite often was levied as the kind of knock on him, and what he was doing was like, well, you just have the biggest budget, so obviously you're going to win. And it's like they won something like 5 out of 6 Tour de France's in a row with 3 different riders, when they were always having other people go somewhere else and become the best rider there. It's like, that does not happen. It doesn't matter if you've got the biggest budget, like that just doesn't happen. And so seeing these teams who are like, okay, we can actually maybe use the budgets that they're spending to have a bit of the kind of Formula One thing, where it's like there's a race for the middle, there's a race for the near the bottom, and there's a race at the top, because we shouldn't be considering this team with this team because it's like 5 times the budget, or one player is paid more than the entire organization of a different team.
Yeah. We would have loved to see Haas get somewhere, right? That would have been nice. But yeah, I think that having a constructors championship would be
Yeah,
quite cool. Yeah. I suppose also like most of my applied work in mainly League Legends has been at sort of that tier 2 level, and seeing what we can achieve with, yes, players are mostly full time nowadays, but like still there are constraints, right? They're remote mainly. Like tier 2 teams are mainly remote. Like I think in rare instances you had a team that was in person. I think, but for the most part, I think they're often remote, and that's a constraint. And to see what you can do in terms of performance with that constraint, and then if you go even down tier 2A or 3, where players meet not 5 days a week to scrim, and like how can they? It's amazing. I think it's amazing to see what can be achieved. Likewise, we've done some research, and we know that that's, for many players, that's also tough because they come in from a full day of work, and whilst the team might not be having an official scrim block that evening, they all grind solo queue because they want to maximize every minute they do have free. I mean, that's how it is, right? That's how performers develop. They put in time and effort. It's just it's hard to find a balance, I think. Anyway.
So one thing you've mentioned a few times, and it's really interesting for me, having no academic background in coaching at all, is this thing of like, okay, I'm going to give an academic answer. That's what I said at the beginning. So this might be an impossible question, but what would you see as the difference between what we see in academia around coaching and what we see in the practical world around coaching? Because in esports, at least, I've seen people have a lot of difficulty in the translation of one to the other. I don't know if that's just true across the board or if it's true here. And I don't know if that's because of academia's fault or practical's fault. But yeah, what do you see as the difference between the two?
You're 100% right, in my opinion, my view of things. I mean, they have a name for it in academia, the research practice gap, where both sides are at fault to some extent. The obvious one would be, coaches aren't spending the time to read academic papers. But honestly, like academia doesn't do themselves any favor getting research out there to coaches. And you often hear about applied work, and that essentially means a paper that's maybe gone out there in the field to collect some data or talk to some people. But often the research is done in sort of quite sanitized environments that don't really translate. And then they put them into impenetrable language into a journal that has a paywall. So of course the coach, the pressures on the coaches right now are immense. Like, to find the time to then go and find papers, make sense of them, and then knowing that there's levels of evidence where a single paper probably isn't enough to inform you about a certain thing to do. You have to read widely and deeply, and sometimes you talk about review papers, which are summaries of lots of articles, and they're kind of hard from a sort of sense-making perspective to get a practical thing from. So I forgive all sides on this, but I think the burden is definitely on the academic world to make it easier. I think what the trend at present is that academic research into coaching tends to highlight a lot of what isn't right about it. So maybe more in terms of coach development, like what's not right about it. So we hear a lot that efforts to develop coaches historically have been, here's a formal coaching course. So specific to your sport, here are the fundamental skills that you need to train, and here's how you do them. So you break down the tennis serve into the ball toss, your feet position, that kind of the feet like stance, that kind of stuff. And then you translate that, and then you take that information and you train coaches to do it, and then you say, okay, go coach, and they fall flat on their face a little bit because they use these terms, they throw these terms quite a lot. They use these terms quite a lot in academic writing about how coaching is complex, it's messy, it's dynamic, there are interpersonal relationships which cloud all of this very nice boxed off, categorized sort of coaching components that are identified in academic writing. So there is this idea that what we're doing in academia doesn't translate because once you put it all together in coaching practice, or rather once you're confronted with coaching in real life, everything comes at you at 100 miles an hour. You don't have time to sit there and neatly identify, well, in this interaction, this was the issue. I'm watching the team and I'm seeing this is the issue. It all comes at you at once. And to make sense of that is immensely hard. And then to write papers about it, to get down to the crux of the issue and to find solutions is also very hard, because how do you measure that? How do you analyze that? So I think academic work has an incredible use and utility for coaches, and I do think esports coaches, if it was just a little bit more easier to digest, would benefit hugely, because there is a lot that has been done in the history of sport and sports coaching research that translates. One example would be, and I know you, having worked with you a little bit, your approach to this, I think, is actually straight out of a couple of research papers, their playbook, and they've reported on what high performance directors tend to do in sport. And I see similarities in your approach to things in terms of wanting to establish a team environment, wanting to establish a culture. But there are research papers out there that have studied high performance environments across the planet, and they've come to the conclusion that high performance environment is constructed in certain ways. There are certain dimensions to it. And they use some terms that are maybe a little bit alien to the aspiring esports coach nowadays, such as role clarity. Like, that's probably a fairly academic term, I think, to many coaches who tend to sort of just assign roles based on gut feeling and sort of social reinforcement. But knowing what that term means can be very easy to translate into practice. So when you're assembling your team as an esports coach at whatever level, do you sit down with your other staff and make sure everyone knows what their role is and who's in charge of what, and who do you go to for support or help to do what? Like, yeah, I think there is easy applications there, but there is definitely, it's almost two different languages. And then on the applied side, the issue is, and I think it really is an issue, because if you're just informed by anecdotal evidence or like popular articles and popular media about coaching, you're leaning heavily on what's worked for one person in one context, and it may not translate. And we spoke earlier about in esports, there isn't really this differentiation between levels of participation. But if you just take what Alex Ferguson or Phil Jackson, or if you just take what some of the biggest coaches in sport did and try and apply it at your tier 3, tier 4 esports level, it might not work. So it might work, it might be a miracle, but it's likely that there will be some differences. It's likely to be ineffective. Like, Phil Jackson, a famous basketball coach that worked with Michael Jordan, he spoke about developing a tribal for games where players could come together and they have some community time together away from the media, no focus on the sport itself, and doing things that were quite abstract for high performance sport at the time. You could translate that into esports, but your players might not see the purpose and they might become quite disillusioned by it, and it might negatively impact performance. But you've just taken it from one context, applied it to another, it hasn't fitted, hasn't worked. So that could be ineffective. At worst, it could be detrimental. So you're sort of using players as guinea pigs. It's kind of a bit of trial and error. Players are maybe in those moments, they're not used to it. So suddenly if we take this tribal space pre-games, players might then use that space to fill it with their own anxieties about performance. It might heighten an awareness of, I don't feel great. And then you unleash them into a competitive tournament where they're being judged left, right, and center. So I think just drawing from a single source, like an autobiography or a podcast, and there are some great podcasts out there, but that has its limitations. And theoretically, research gives you an evidence base that is a bit more robust, because at least the authors of the research have tried to do things objectively. So they should report objectively. There is always some subjectivity to it, but they should report objectively what they think is going on. And then we're not there yet with esports, but if you have enough work, you get a body of work which can give you a pretty good idea of what works and what doesn't work. But that's a long ramble. I think it's a hugely important question, though.
I mean, it's perfect. It's a perfect answer. I think there's a couple of things to touch on before it leads us nicely on to the next thing that I wanted to talk about. But
Oh dear.
the first thing is you mentioning like inherited wisdom there, and I think, or learning from what other people are doing, and absolutely, it's a different environment, it's a different level of competition. Even if it's a different team in the same environment as you're going to execute it in a different way. I know, for example, one of the things that I think has been really great is that during this last year, Romain on G2 has been really public about what he does. And at one point, I think it was on Yamato or someone, or maybe it was on a post-game lobby thing in the LEC, someone was asking him, like, the classic thing in esports is we're scared to kind of give away secrets. And he was basically like, if anyone copies me, they're not going to do it like me. So it's fine. It's like, I think it was like one of the really early incredible Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners used to, like, one of the Gracies, maybe, I can't remember, but he was famous for recording his practices, and I think he would sell them, like back when you sold tapes of your practice, and he would make them available to anyone, including people who were going to compete against him. And it was his training camps for the competitions that he used to record. And someone asked him, I think it was Josh Waitskin, who's a great guy to look into, but that's a different point. Asked him, like, you're not worried about this? And he's like, if someone copies me, they're playing my game and I'm better at it than them. So it's okay. But yeah, with all this stuff, I think the best thing to do is ask yourself, why is this coach doing this? And do I agree with the reasons rather than just the practice? Because if you want to just steal the exact way G2 sets up a culture, because they seem to have an incredibly effective culture and they're the best team in Europe by miles and have been for ages. I mean, maybe it works for you, but probably it doesn't. It definitely doesn't work as well, because you're not the same, your environment's not the same, everything's different. So just constantly asking yourself, what are the reasons behind this, and trying to get to, all right, do we agree with those reasons or disagree? Because the other thing in esports is that a lot of the practices that we're doing, which is what everyone's done for a decade, that's not a good reason to do it. Because I was here a decade ago and I know how much we knew about performance at that point. And I wouldn't do anything that I was doing a decade ago. So even just this idea that scrims are the one and only way to improve as a team, it's like, maybe that's true, but maybe that's just because that's what everyone's been doing. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount there.
Yeah, 100%. We did a study recently where we actually asked professional league players, I think the sample size was like 10 or 11. We asked them about what is effective training to you, and it came to light that they weren't entirely sure. They all did the same thing from 10 different teams. None of them were quite sure why they did it, and some of them spoke about alternative method, like pedagogies, methodologies, like blitz scrims came up. Like, yeah, I've heard the term, we've done it once, didn't really see the point. We went back to just playing full games as much as we could. Yeah, and I think that's socially reinforced. I've even spoken to a coach who said, I see that there might be other ways of doing things, but it's not what my players expect, and therefore I can't implement it. So this social reinforcement is super strong. And it's, yeah, there likely are different ways to do it. One that makes me laugh, I don't know if you heard about it, you undoubtedly have, the New Zealand All Blacks. There was a book written about them called Legacy. You might have even read it, I'm sure.
Love it.
Great book, right? It's so fun. There's so much in there. There's so many things that sound like you should do this. And I think one of the commandments almost was sweep the sheds.
Yeah.
And like I have no doubt that there are coaches out there in esports that like suddenly think that I need to do that, so I'm going to get my players to clean their desks after every practice. So that's going to be a key part of our, or before or during every scrim. That's going to be like a key part of it. But putting it through that filter, like you say, like, why are we doing this? Is it appropriate in my context with my people? Like that's crucial.
Yeah, and trying to understand what it's about. Like, is it about actually, taking a broom kind of thing?
Yeah,
And one of the things actually that I think you talk about, being sort of widely read or like trying to get from different sources. One of the things I think that's so fascinating whenever you're doing that about these kind of topics, I mean, I'm sure it's true about other things, but especially about sort of leadership, communication, performance, all that kind of thing, is you have people who come from wildly different backgrounds with the same thing. So Jocko Willink, who's a ex-Navy SEAL, but also trained officers and was an officer, and he runs like leadership things and stuff. One of his key fundamentals is, I think he calls it picking up brass. And it's the exact same thing. It's like every now and again, so the brass is the shell casings after training. Right. And it's like every now and again, the most senior person should also be like going through the field, picking up. It's just a really boring, stupid task that almost always the lowest person does, like sweeping the sheds after training. That's just the, where they all come in. Obviously, rugby is very muddy sport, so it becomes a very muddy area. So sweeping the sheds, picking up brass, same idea. And it's like, I don't think either of them have anything to do with cleaning.
No.
But it's much easier to see that if you've read both of those examples.
Yes. Well said. Jocko Willink, also an interesting example. Long before I was involved in esports, I think I had a conversation about his book. Was it Complete Ownership? Ultimate Ownership?
Extreme ownership.
And I had quite an alarming conversation with a coach who was talking about this as their approach to coaching. Demanding a high level of accountability on players and themselves, and themselves as the leader of the pack. And it sounds really good, except that in sport and esport, we're not in the military. You as the leader, if that's what you consider yourself as a coach, you as the leader are not running into battle alongside your soldiers. Like you are on the sidelines making calls. So how does that translate? Are you then like an enforcer of never letting up in practice and training, and with like values and standards and codes around that? But ultimately, when it comes down to it, you're not in the field with them, so it doesn't quite translate. But there are, as you say, it's not really the message he's conveying. Like, it's not that you need to put pressure on everyone to attain the highest standards, because ultimately you're not involved in that, whereas you might be in the military. It's something behind that. So yeah, I think that's a very, very big, a huge point.
Yeah. And I mean, even, if you go on to, I wouldn't say read that whole book, and then maybe you would change your mind, but definitely read any of his other books as well. It becomes quite clear that that's like the opposite of his point. And, I'm sure it was very effective when he was in the army, but he's at this stage almost cursed with an incredibly deep voice. And obviously he's absolutely huge as well. So people have a tendency to think that he's going to be like really, really, let's force everyone to take ownership over everything. And that's the opposite really of the whole approach and stuff like that. And so, I think you just have to be careful with translating stuff either from academic work or practical work.
100%.
One of the things I definitely want to get to, because I've realized we've already gone for an hour, so I definitely want to get to it. And it does tie in to what you were just saying. So I want to talk about some of the papers that you've been involved with, especially one you just touched on, with the idea of breaking down barriers. So this is a free podcast. This clip will go out just by itself. Let's break down some barriers. Perceptions of effective training practices, I think, was the title. But if you could start by just a kind of brief summary of why you wanted to do this, who you did it with, and what was the beginning of the approach before we even start to get into what you actually found.
Certainly. So this was a paper that I co-authored with Callum Abbott, who's a sport and exercise psychologist, and Dr. Phil Birch, who's a psychology researcher and senior lecturer. And I think the heart of the paper was, we wanted to look at sort of almost, it was fueled by this idea of looking at the utility and the usage of sports psychology in League of Legends. So where was the role of an applied sports psychologist? So given that Callum is an applied sports psychologist, it was like, where is the role of that individual supporting training, supporting players. And we all sat down and we spoke about, how could we investigate where is useful to provide that kind of sports psychology support in an esports team, in a League of Legends team. And actually, before you could even answer that question, you really have to have some objective understanding of what goes on in League of Legends training in the scrim environment. And that sounds so obvious, right? Everyone knows what happens inside a scrim, but in academia, you build on objective research knowledge, you build on previous publications, and where there isn't that knowledge in print, in writing, with a clear understanding of what methodology was used and the objectivity behind it, you sort of have to break that ground first, because it could be that your assumptions are wrong, and what you're observing could be wrong because it's just your lens, your view on the world. So we had to take a step back, and to answer the question of what is currently being done, we went out and we tried to find as high a profile sample as possible. And I think we managed to access all tier 2 professional League of Legends players. And we sat down and we interviewed them. So we used a methodology, a qualitative approach as opposed to a quantitative approach. And we were quite inductive. So that meant that we went out there with an open book, really. We had some questions around what do you do. We probed into sort of why do you do it? How do you find it? What are the outcomes of what you do, to try and gauge whether they were effective? And that's the opposite of what we might use would be a deductive approach, where we have an idea and we seek to confirm it or reject it. So we really went out quite open and asked players like, what's going on? And yeah, the idea was to fill in this foundation of get a clear picture of what's going on, but also the follow-up part of the paper was, within that same paper, was, is it seen as effective? So that was where we started. What next question?
I mean, next question would just be to be going on, what did you find? But I think one of the things, again, like you're saying there, is like the lens that you're seeing these things has to be taken into account, and that's just what we were just talking about. But yeah, I think so what did you find? You've touched on it a little bit, but in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so I think we break it down into how the process of doing this research is that you transcribe hours of interview into written word, and you read through that and you highlight patterns, and then you highlight quotes that stand out to you, and you sort of piece it together, and you try and put your biases aside and say, this seems to matter, what do you think? And at the end of it, you come up with themes. And we created, I think, three main themes. The first one was around what was being done. And we found that overwhelmingly across these 10 or 11 players, there was a consistent pattern of, we play as many games as possible as a team, as frequently as possible, in the form of scrims. So we play 4 games against another team, and it's not always the same team, but it's usually of similar standard. It sometimes isn't, and there are implications associated with all of that. But that's essentially the. And then there was some talk about other things they might do. So there was some mention of, occasionally we might mix it up with, for example, we're having a blitz scrim every now and then, where we just play the first 14 minutes. And then we count gold lead at the end, for example. Sometimes we do ARAMs, sometimes we do 2v2. I think the second most trained modality was actually 1v1. I mean, just amazing if you think about that in the light of sports training, that is just so different. Like you don't have like a broken down practice modality. You don't use practice tools seriously. You VOD review a hell of a lot. So yes, that happens in sport, but it was, scrim block 5 games, review 5 games, big post review, next morning big review, like so much rewatching of the game. Individual practice, like with the coach, didn't really exist. It was more coaches saying, you need to work on this, go away and work on this, which is interesting as well. So there's a suggestion there, and also in subsequent work that I'm involved in, that coaches aren't really responsible for the technical development of skill. So it's kind of assumed that players are doing the right thing if they're missing constant, if they're not very good at last hitting minions, they are then assigned the task to go away and practice last hitting minions. There isn't really much work with a coach, which kind of goes against what we might think of as sort of expert feedback. Just go away and do it. Go away and review this. VOD review this game. Tell me what you need to improve. Bring back new ideas. It's all done quite independently, but it was super consistent. So that's kind of where we are. It felt with League of Legends, at least.
I think they're just. I think they're super consistent is maybe not a positive thing, in terms of it. I wouldn't say it's super consistent. I mean, you touched on it already, but it's not super consistent because everyone's looked at all the things that they can look at and come to the same conclusions. It's super consistent because that's the thing that we do. Therefore, that's what we do.
Yes, that's how it felt, extremely. And the effectiveness as well was alarming. So in the second theme, we captured whether this was perceived to be effective. And some just frightening quotes that came from it. Like one player admitted they don't know why they do it. It's just a done thing. One player didn't see the point of doing other things. So, is the point of having even attempting a blitz scrim, was that just for variation? Was that just for a mix up? And was that just for variety, novelty? Didn't really get the point. And that's not on that player, I would say. I think it's on the coach, if not the team, to decide what they're looking for in those circumstances. That didn't seem to really take place. But then the consequences were a little bit, they went further. So these are tier 2 players. One player had a day job and felt the pressure to get home and squeeze in a 5-game block at the end of a day after a full day of work. Spoke about wearing down on him mentally, which was a bit alarming. Another player spoke about how, on top of the frequency of those long scrim blocks, he also felt in season the need to maintain a high game rank. So he was also playing a volume of solo queue before and after practice. And this was echoed by all the players, I think. The volume of sort of independent play before and after scrim blocks and on days off was also very high, maintaining to a high game rank. Despite a physical injury during the season. So maintaining all of that load and not seeing an alternative, because the player spoke about, if I drop off on any of it, my chances of my next contract are less. So I have to maintain it. So a little bit alarming there. Interesting that there was, the players, I think, were keen on the social learning impact. So they would VOD review, but they'd also watch other players on Twitch. They'd watch pro players as much as they could to try and get insights from them. Maybe didn't rely on the coach all that much for individual feedback, but that sounded like it was a time thing as much as it was as an expertise thing. But certainly players learning from players was a big part of it. Yeah, and health and well-being implications of just this grind culture, which just seemed to shape everything. And not a great deal in terms of health and wellness and well-being and physical activity. That wasn't mentioned so much, but you could tell that the load for this one individual, a full day of work, full training block, like physically that wasn't great, mentally that wasn't great, well-being wasn't sustained, perhaps. So some implications there that I think as an industry, what's cool about the paper is not cool, but like those themes that we identified in 10 or 11 players echoes the articles we're reading from most levels of play. So there was an article last year, a lot of players and a lot of teams experiencing challenges with well-being and mental health because of the training load, perhaps. And of course, teams are doing better, I think, in terms of bringing in specialist staff like Ismail over at G2, implementing within that high performance level competition involves intensity, involves a lot of training load within the highest structured support possible. And it's good to see that that's increasingly coming in, but it does seem to me that we don't necessarily know if full grind culture is the best Sometimes the answer is, well, look at Korea, look at China. The 20 best players on the planet come from that region. They play a lot of games, therefore that is how it should be. But then we don't have the objective evidence that it is, and yet it's the overwhelming default. So that was a takeaway from this paper. And then finally, I don't know if there's anything, but for me, as a sort of, I'm not a sports psychologist, but I look at things through a very psychological lens. One of the final themes reflected this change in motivation in terms of, I think the gaming career, the professional player's career, is a lack of coaching at the start and a lot of playing for fun and a lot of autonomous learning and independent scheduling of your play and freedom. And you get really good. And the games are just perfect coaches at that initial phase, right? They give you real-time feedback. They give you everything you could possibly want in terms of challenge, optimal challenge. And you get really, really good, and you're connected with friends who also play the same game. And you get to a level where suddenly a coach swoops in or a team manager swoops in. You're really good, come play for my team. And then suddenly you're thrown into this team environment where you're being told what to do. You're being told like when to turn up and where. You're being told who to play with. You're being told like performance is critical. You're now going to go and do it, and you're watched in front of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. Everything about your performance is going to be posted online. And there was a shift, a real shift. Like it seemed like there was this shift in I play for fun, and then suddenly I play for external reasons, and I have no choice. And then the further you go, this sense that I'm forced into this box. I now don't have an alternative. Like it's now my career. I've invested so much time in it. I have to make it to the next level because dropping out isn't an option. And all of it, I would say, completely understandable and completely human. And it's no fault, I think, on anyone except on a societal, cultural level. There didn't seem to be much tolerance for an alternative way of doing things. Does that resonate with your experience?
Yeah, I mean, a lot. There's sort of so many battles to fight if you want to change anything as a coach, which again is why I'm constantly pushing for this role to be and a role to exist above the normal head coach. And I mean, there's so many things to touch on what you said. I've wrote down a bunch of things, but some of them now are kind of so far away from what we got onto and the kind of seriousness of what it ended up on. One of the things that I would say on what you said on the end is that when I was doing video work in the scene, I wanted to talk as much as possible about these kind of things because from the outside, it's obviously incredibly, not necessarily incredibly glamorous, but an enviable job to be doing. And it is. That is a big part. And I think we can easily fall onto the side of sort of complaining about it too much. And a lot of times these are people who've not had a normal real job complaining about playing the game for fun. I mean, for not for fun, for a job. But the thing that is definitely really important is that so many people I found hadn't really decided to do this.
Right.
In a way. It's like I wanted to ask people like, okay, why are you a League of Legends player? And then kind of just that was the whole interview. If we could go hours on that, then sure. And it's for most people, it wasn't ever a conscious decision. It was exactly like you said. They played a load. Probably as they were doing that, they sacrificed a huge amount. The very standard story from people who are esports pros. They're mostly very intelligent people. It's like I was doing really well at school. I found League of Legends. I started doing really terrible at school, but it's okay because now I'm here making money playing the game. Whereas there's obviously thousands of people who have the first three parts of that and they didn't make it. So, that's already a big thing to kind of consider. There's a huge amount of sacrifices that you have to make to be the best at anything, and that includes League of Legends. But mostly it was like no one sat down and thought, I want to do this. They just got to a certain level, and like you say, someone contacted them straight from the ladder, and then they did that, and then it kind of went on. And I think as well, they come into a team and then they have to practice like team players practice, which might not be the best for them at all. And I think a good thing that I would say as a piece of advice to coaches who are listening to this, with the caveat that you won't be able to change everything you want to change, because like we said, and we can get onto that in a bit as well, but I would just do the, I don't know how you'd call it, but like do the small child thing and just ask why, and don't be happy with just a shitty answer. So, okay, on this team, we're all playing 10 games of solo queue as well as scrims. It's like, okay, why? Like, because you play solo queue to be good at the game. It's like, okay, why? Then why are we playing scrims if solo queue is what makes us good at the game, or whatever it might be? And you might not come to this conclusion, but I think the conclusion that often comes to from people when you're doing that, it's like, okay, we're playing scrims so that we're playing solo queue so that when we're in scrims, everyone's individual performance doesn't affect our learning as a team. And then you say, okay, that's now something we can actually work with. Then if you had that as the thing, why would you ever think everyone needs to play X number of games? Like if you came in saying, right, we all just need to be able to, in scrims, you should know the lane matchups well enough so that you're not 0-10 by the time we do stuff as a team kind of thing, or you know what wave you should be crashing and how to play on bounces or whatever. If you had that as your goal, I don't think maybe people still would, but I think a lot less people would then just say, right, it has to be this number, because it doesn't matter. Who cares? Like someone might need 20 games to get to that level on a certain champion. Someone might need 3. Someone might not even play. They might just watch other people play, and that's the best way they learn. And so as soon as you ask why enough, and you're not happy with just because it's what other people do or because it's what this team does and they're the best, as soon as you actually go a bit deeper, you can start to think, okay, what do I actually think? Because this is what we actually need. We don't need anyone. It doesn't matter at all to your performance if you play solo queue. What matters to your performance is that when we come together as a team, you know your individual role. And I would say, I was actually having this conversation the other day, I think I might have even said like 90% at the time. Maybe that's a bit high. So now that we're recording this, I'll say I think potentially as high as 80% of scrims are not wasted, but are made way less productive because people are failing at things individually. And if they're failing at things individually, why are we as a group learning? There's an analogy that I really like that's been said a lot, but I think it's just completely true, which is it's like you're teaching an orchestra a piece, and because of scrims, we all come together and we all learn at the same time. And that is just a ridiculous idea. Like everyone should go off and learn their individual role, and then we come together and play the same piece. But to do that, following that analogy more, you've got to actually know what piece you're trying to play.
Yes.
Because if you there are so many variables. And so unless you can be consistent with saying every game we're going to play this certain style, or today we're going to play this certain style, or maybe this 1 or 2 certain styles, unless you can do that, there's almost too much to learn from an individual point of view. But it's normally each day of scrims, from my decade of doing this, I think there's probably 1 or 2 games where I think there wasn't actually individual stuff that should have been done better in this game. And that might even be even too much to say that 1 or 2 games happened every day. So you got 5 games or you got 6 games, depending on what people decide they want to do. And 4, 5, or sometimes 6 of them are massively impacted by individual things not going right.
Maybe just I love all of that. I just, the one thing that I was thinking about was I feel like, so in an orchestra, if somebody keeps playing the wrong notes, like you're not going to spend orchestra group time together exposing a lack of musical knowledge here. You're not going to spend like orchestra altogether time working for that individual. Fully agree. I feel like maybe League of Legends, you have to accommodate that to some extent, though. Maybe players, they don't. There isn't necessarily one music sheet to complete the goal, and I feel like maybe there is a need to accommodate, to learn to play with people that are sometimes playing the wrong notes because they contribute something else. But otherwise, I think that's it's pretty alarming that it can interrupt the team learning process so much when someone turns up and
Yeah.
they play the wrong notes, right?
I think actually maybe I would phrase it in a slightly different way. I don't mean individual mistakes because they're absolutely part of how things go. Like, you miss a skill shot, you catch a skill shot you shouldn't, like you miss CS, all that kind of thing. That's going to happen. I don't mean that. What I think maybe what I would say is the individual part of the team game. People make a mistake on that. So I'm a champion that in this game, my role is to peel for my backline, and instead I engage, or instead I flank. That kind of thing, where it's like a decision made around, I don't know, I need a different word for a mistake, a decision made around the team stuff that, decision rather than just a mistake, because of course, I'm a big believer in no high performance environment can exist without accepting mistakes, which is also, I think, another huge problem in League of Legends and in the way we coach teams. I don't think I've ever been on a team that has really been comfortable with mistakes. And that's potentially why everything is also so stale, because you have to be quite brave really to say, actually, we're going to do things a bit differently. But yeah, what I mean is that knowing your individual role within this game is something that so often ruins team practice, and that's what I mean, rather than people just missing something that they would normally hit or something like that.
Is solo queue a good place to learn that, though? I mean, the reports I hear is it.
No, not at all. Because again, your role, the thing that solo queue is the worst at is that, which is your role in a team game, because it doesn't matter how high elo you get, you can get away with not doing your role correctly, and also certain. Again, role, there's not really the right term, or I don't know, I should say, the right terminology for this, because role obviously would mean like top jungle. Well, I mean,
function almost.
Yeah, your function in the game is often, there are certain functions in the game in solo queue that are way more rewarding in terms of you're much more likely to win if you are playing engaged than if you're playing disengaged in solo queue. It doesn't matter how high elo you are, even at the very top of the ladder, because people make more mistakes than they do in competitive games because the game is faster, all that kind of thing. So that kind of thing is definitely way more rewarded. But I actually think, we are getting more and more positional coaches, but I actually think the work of positional coaches could end up being as important or more important than scrims. I'd much rather have 3 games of scrims where everyone knows exactly what their role is in the game, and then a lot of time dedicated around that to making sure that that is true, than 6 games, or people now doing like 10 games, or saying you have to work 12 hours a day. It's like the quality of the learning that we do in esports is so low that I think upping the quantity is just really, really silly. And that's due to some things. I would say, I don't want to go too hard on coaches, because there are some real big constraints, like you mentioned right near the beginning of the thing you're talking about, the paper. There's no way to break down the game. So the practice tool is not appropriate for learning most things. And there's no sandbox tool, and blitz scrims is the only way we have to break down any stage of the game. But it has to be the beginning, because it starts at the beginning. And that's why blitz scrims are the thing that people have heard of, because most people have had that chain of thought with like, okay, I can't break down the game, but I could just do the beginning over and over, and that means we're drilling the early game, and then we can get 10 early games in instead of 3. And that is true, but they maybe don't convey that well to the players or the other team, and you have no control of the practice environment because you are only coaching 5. You're only coaching half of the players in the practice environment. So even when we come back to what I was just talking about, even if all your players know their role in the game can still be quote unquote ruined by someone on the other team not knowing their role. And suddenly it's like, right, well, the classic one for me is like, we're in a situation where any 5v5 team fight, if we can make a 5v5 team fight happen, we will win that 5v5 and we'll win the game. But we really struggle to do it. And then eventually they engage on us, we kill them all, we win the game. And we're like, great, we won the game. We got our 5v5 fight. We did really well. We needed a 5v5 and there was a 5v5. And you're like, yeah, but they are the ones who
They
made
messed
that
up.
happen.
Yeah.
So that then instantly just makes everything the same again. Like it's just there's so many things that go into it.
Yeah, 100%. Like that one player wasn't where they should be or would be 99 times out of 100. Yeah, I fully agree. I have something a colleague of mine, Kabir Bubner, is doing that we're starting to implement more with teams that we work with, is something called a constraints-led approach, where you take something away within the game environment. So, for example, communication, you take it away at a certain phase of a game, and with the intention to sort of direct attention towards something that's missing or something that emerges as a result of thing. And I think there's real promise with something like that. And there's promise at different levels. Like perhaps the base level would be, if you're playing 3, 6 or more games, it's at least some variety. Like you are at least experiencing a different perspective on a game. Maybe you're drawing attention to just how important something like communication is and how to use it. Perhaps more so, it maybe directs your attention to using the minimap more to understand where your jungler is at a given time, that kind of stuff. So I think there is emerging work there, but it's acceptance, and then it's, can we deliver it to coaches in a way where they start with, why do I want to take this away? So not just blindly doing it.
Yeah, I mean, at some point I'm definitely getting Kabir on to talk about this as well.
Yes.
It's something I'm a big fan of and have done a lot in my career, although I wouldn't have called it a constraints-led approach. But some of the examples, there was a team actually that I was on where for a decent part of the season, if we had played ourselves and one team wasn't allowed to talk, the team that wasn't allowed to talk would have won the game. basically 9 times out of 10.
Oh my god!
And so that was actually a really good thing to do, to start saying like, okay, we're going to have no talking at all. We're going to have talking only after a certain point. Having the no talking is one of the things that I think can be very useful for that, is making sure that everyone's using pings properly, because just because you've said something doesn't mean people have seen it or heard it. And so you should always be integrating pings as well, but we often don't realize until we start having these kind of no talking before 15 minutes, and you realize that actually you can communicate a lot just with pings, and also people can intuit this kind of thing. A great way to sell it that has luckily happened in the last year is that the best team fighting team of all time by a substantial margin is JDG from last year, potentially one of the best teams of all time, let alone but definitely the best team fighting team. They didn't all speak the same language. So if you think we have to be non-stop talking in team fights, I mean, maybe we should be, but if you think we have to be, then this just makes absolutely no sense at all. But you can also get quite specific around some of these constraints, or I used to call them obstructions, just because in one of my favorite movies is Lars von Trier movie it's called The 5 Obstructions, and it's just remaking the same film with or he gets his mentor to remake the same film with a bunch of different constraints. Like one of them is every shot has to be half a second long or something like that, and all this kind of thing. So they're real extreme constraints. But one of the things that I did, I don't know if you were, I can't remember if you guys were there helping us at the same time, we did with Solari, was we made a rule that we were not going to take Dragon in practice. Like we were not allowed to take Dragon. And I can actually, now I'm not involved anymore, I can go through the kind of step-by-step of how we got there.
Yeah, please.
The first is that this was before Dragons were buffed, so I wouldn't necessarily do the same thing now. But we looked at T1, who were the best team in the world at the time. And even though they had a massive early game, they had I think they had maybe the second lowest Dragon take of any top-level team. And the lowest was like the 10th place team in the LCS or something, who just never could take any Dragons. And so we started watching their games and started seeing some of the things that they were doing instead. But also it was just quite difficult to understand, because looking at someone else, especially when they're playing at such a different level, there's probably stuff going on. It's not that you're not seeing, it's just that it's not happening. Because the example I always use is like, okay, they did a certain thing and then people countered it in practice. So then they countered the counter, and now you're seeing the counter of the counter, but you didn't see, the steps of how you got there. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was just take a few less dragons. But then it happened often that we're in a situation where like, okay, look, dragon is free here, so we take it. And I use that word very specifically. And so we implemented for, I think it was a full week in preseason. I said, you're not allowed to take dragons. And so for the first few times, it was quite funny. And Joko he did make it happen, but he did have a bit of fun with it at the beginning. There was a few times where we sort of double killed their bot lane. He'd run to Dragon Pit and look at me and say, am I really not allowed to take this? And I just said, no, definitely not. So I think he even a couple of times said in the comms, right, let's all just imagine we have 6% AP and AD from this dragon. Because John said we can't take it. But then what started happening is you have to do something else. Yeah. So what are you going to do with your tempo, with your time advantage? So even if, the first few times you just recalled instead of taking dragon, and suddenly we're out on the map 15 seconds quicker, and then the next play becomes slightly easier, or suddenly we prioritize getting like a deep ward, or we invade their red buff or something. And it gradually got more and more fluid until when we took away this rule and you're allowed to take dragons again, we did take some dragons, but we took far, far, far less than we did before. And we started realizing that free is definitely not the right word, because free, we were using it meaning they can't do anything while we're taking this. They're not going to get anything while we get this. Yeah. But we're not taking into account the opportunity cost and the fact that we're spending 15, 20 seconds time doing this, and time is the most valuable resource in League of Legends. So what could we have been doing with that time? And so that kind of thing has been really, really useful. But having specific purpose for why you're doing each one is, I think, really, really important. And that has been very useful. But it's only when like I can remember a specific thing we're trying to learn, and we could develop a specific kind of practice for that, where I think, that should be your approach in everything, but you're probably just going to fail to come up with a specific way to learn most of the things that you're going to learn, at least with the tools that we have. I put in our LEC application with Excel, the one thing, because they asked like, what should we do to make esports better, basically? And I put, make a proper sandbox practice tool or save states in the game where we can just set up a Baron and then run that 5 times. So we've been asking for that for whatever it is, 7 years now. But it's I don't think it's ever going to happen. And so we're just going to have to work with the constraints that we have as coaches.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that dragon sort of constraint. I love it. It makes so much sense. As soon as you say, okay, we have to do something else instead, what opens up? And you can imagine like a deep ward would almost like keep dragon available to you whilst you have the early recall or stuff like that. That sounds so... Of course, I think the thing with, as soon as you get into these conversations, you get into like the nuance of the... Sometimes your champion really needs that buff, and to some extent, but like as a rule, like it's just interesting to explore when and why, and know that it's on the table.
Yeah,
it makes me think of I hate to always do this. It's been years since I was a head coach in basketball, but when I was, we used to have players that were quite athletic at a fairly high level, and they felt that their strength was getting out into the open court and beginning what we might call a fast break. So in training, if we were playing a game 5-on-5, one player would leak out and try and get a step on his man and sprint down the court as early as possible, and we'd often look for that long pass, easy basket. That's not what we wanted. That wasn't our weakness as a team. Our weakness was sort of being on the same page when it came to the slower 5-on-5 half-court play. So you take that away. Let's not do that because we have it. We know we've got it. Let's try and work on something else. And in basketball, quite simple. You know this situation is going to occur just like this. You know your 5 players. League of Legends, there are nuances to it. But as a rule, what a nice idea, I think. Just to explore what else is visible. So
yeah, I do think you are kind of constrained a bit by the players as well, and this is where if you did have control of the practice environment, if you did have 10 people, it would be much better. I used to think that substitutes in League of Legends would be good, if we had infinite money. It would be good because of the swapping people in or the pressure. But now I think by far the best reason is so that you can actually control the practice environment, and you can have some practices where it doesn't matter what you do, because unless you're G2 or unless you're the biggest team in your league, if you start doing things like never taking dragons and it goes badly and suddenly you lose all the games, you might never get a scrim against this team again. They're like, why would we practice against them? They don't ever take dragon, and we really struggle with defending against that or something like that. And so unless you're the team that no matter what G2 do, you're going to want to scrim G2 if you're in the LEC. So they can try this. And then also you've got players who are kind of more accepting of this. And I think another thing coaches can do and should do is differentiate between exploratory practice and execution practice.
Nice.
What Simon Cox said at the Esports Summit was like red light, green light, or the different lights, red, orange, and green practice, where you can have, this is like full, we are drafting what we're drafting tomorrow in our competitive game. We're not practicing, we're not like exploring anything. We're just fully going for executing on the things that we know we can do well. And then you also have practice all the way on the other end of the spectrum. And I think if you take what happened this year is that the game has changed a huge amount, potentially more than it ever has in between seasons. Some real proper exploratory practice would be needed, but at least there could be people who have done it, but I've not talked to people who've done this kind of thing. We're like, okay, we've got a new objective in the game, these grubs. So for a week, let's not take anything else other than grubs and see how good they are. Because every game it's like, right, we played 6 games today. In some of them we got all 6, but we were already like 5k up, so we won. In some of them we got none and we lost because the enemy was just massively ahead. It's like before, when it was just Herald or Dragon, gradually we worked out what you would get by prioritizing Herald and what you would get by prioritizing Dragon, like we as a whole scene, as a whole game. But it could have been much faster by like forcing it in practice. Like, okay, if we always prioritize Herald, how often do we win? What are the things that we need to win? And then, like you said, what are the champions that need to do that? And this is where I said one of the biggest problems is we don't know what piece we're going to play when we start the practice. So how can we all be ready to play that piece? If this game, it turns out we have to play poke, and next game it turns out we have to play front to back, and next game we have to play split push. So I think having some consistency when it comes in can lead these constraints to be much better. But the downside, I think I've seen when I've seen them implemented, or even when I've implemented them myself, is that if you're changing a lot of different things as well, then suddenly not only are the results potentially not, I don't know how you'd say it, like not valid, but also you can add a load more stress of like people just not enjoying it because they're just getting smashed, and also then you've got the thing at the beginning where they're not getting smashed in practice versus people on their team. They're getting smashed by people on a different team who know them, who will meet them in solo queue, who will meet them in competitive, who will maybe be the person who says, actually, I don't want that guy. I know he played well in competitive, but he always runs it down in scrims. This is just falling. Wait, one second. My set is falling apart. Let me see if I can get that back. Okay, good. We're good.
Happens to all the pros.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to ask, it's sort of related, but why is it not the done thing to have a scrim set or a scrim block of both teams play the same champions each time? Why is that not the done thing?
You can often get quite similar, but mostly I think it's not the done thing because people are not prepared enough, and they are also too, we all say, we scrim to learn rather than we scrim to win, but we don't act that. We say it, but we don't act that. And so if you lose to something in the first game, the chances of you being able to say, right, let's just run it back, is pretty low. But we are, I think, heading that way a little bit, where I've heard of teams now who, with the standard thing in ERL1 and LEC now is 3 games break 3 games, which is already better. Although We're doing 3-bake-3, but we're still doing the exact same thing that everyone always does. We're doing 20 minutes in between each game where we do 15 minutes of VOD review, all that kind of thing, rather than just, I don't know, what would happen if we did 3 games back to back to back and then a review of all the games, so that rather than focusing on stuff, we did this wrong this game, we did this wrong this game, we did this wrong this game, we can instead say over the 3 games, these were our biggest mistakes. That's a separate point. But people are doing like, okay, the first 3 games were blue side and you're red side. Then we do a break. Then we're red side and you're blue side. And that I think is really, really good. But mostly when I talk to coaches or when I work with coaches, I think pretty much every single client that I've ever worked with, I've had a moment where I'm like, scrims don't have to be like that. Scrims are just whatever we want to do to train. So scrims can be whatever you want to be, but most people just do them like that because they do them like that. And then you find out every single team is actually interested in doing something different, but no one ever does something different because they all say, oh, but the other team's got to agree to something different, and no one ever does. Yeah. And it's like we're all like Emperor's new clothes in it, like ourselves. So no one changes everything because we all assume no one else will change anything. And that's where I don't think we would be doing 3-bake-3 unless that's what like G2 wanted to do. If they didn't want to do that, then we wouldn't do it because it just filters down top to bottom. Whereas, you know, what I've always pushed for at teams, but it's been difficult, but it's finding scrim partners that are people who are a decent, the right level for you, that you agree like, right, we're going to scrim you every week. And for the first few weeks, sure, it's going to feel like normal scrims. But after a month or 2, or even in the second split of the year, it's going to start to feel like this is a bit different, where we can actually try things and we can actually agree like, okay, you know, the big one for me is like a new champion comes out and everyone bans it. It's available in competitive at the end of the week. And there's been weeks, for example, one of the newest champions when I was last coaching, it was like Renata or something, that I thought from looking at it, this is going to be not only good, but competitively viable kind of champion from the design. And we went through an entire week of scrims and we played it like twice, and I never banned it because I always say, I want to learn about it. Like I don't want to get rid of it the whole time because maybe it's really strong and maybe it's not. And so we got 2 games out of whatever, 5 times 4 or how many scrim days. And even that ask people to not ban it. And they're like, no, it's too strong. Or no, we're not going to play it because we're going to ban it in competitive. And
unknown quantity, we need to get rid of it.
Yeah. Whereas I would say the opposite. Unknown quantity, let's learn as much about it as possible. So like these grubs, what happens if every game we play for grubs? Maybe it sucks, but at least then you'd know.
Yeah. We're working with a little bit more information, and there's no guarantee that the other way gets us a little bit more information anyway. Yeah, but I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, and I think you're a coach from experience. I think you handle the uncertainty of it all a little bit better in your sort of use of questioning with players and acceptance that like your players as a team are never in complete control. So you got to make the best out of it. But everything you're saying, I sympathize with the difficulty of like where we're currently at, because it's just it's training, but it's not training, isn't it? Like everyone can see the outcome of what you're training and what you're working on, and we have to sort of go against human nature to say, don't worry about being seen to be losing. Like don't it's I don't love throwing this term around, but like this idea of being vulnerable a little bit, like you feel you don't want to expose to people that might one day look to sign you or make an opinion of your competency. You don't want to be seen to be not the best or not winning or not strong, because they can't see behind the scenes that like that one playing a new champion, or you were taking away a possibility of taking an objective, for example, like that was your intention and you wanted to learn from it, and we can't see the learning as much as we can see the outcome. So it's really against human nature. It's hugely difficult.
And this is, I think, one of the problems with, it can be in academia, but also in this kind of discussion, is that it's very easy, especially when we have similar ideas, to forget the actual world that we live in And the problem is that players are right to be worried about this because people do make decisions based on who their player wants to sign, and players do judge other players based on how well they play in scrims.
Yeah.
So you can say all this and have these great ideas about making sure practice is just practice, but the players are right to be scared of that. They're not. It's not just scared because it's human nature, which is definitely true, but they also have plenty of real world evidence of people not getting jobs because the big player on the other team doesn't like them from solo queue or doesn't like them from scrims or something like that, and happens all the time. So
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? Like, you think you can risk your job to test my theory about how we should learn League of Legends? It's like, this is crazy.
Yeah. Brutal. It almost needs like a league-wide, like the league that you're in needs to enforce these exploratory days, yellow or green flag days. Like it needs to say on this day, it's expected that everyone messes around. Yeah. Buy-in. It's buy-in on a massive scale. That
and again, it has to be. It's always very complicated because again, when I say like an exploratory day or a day where you're even messing around and having more fun with it, which is also another benefit, is that you have to be very clear about like if people are having too much fun with it individually. Again, we don't learn stuff as a group. There are players, Expect, for example, when we were on Excel, even in serious scrims, he's going to go 0-10 or 10-0. And that might be the best for him to learn about the matchup so he can completely limit test. And he would somehow do that every game all week and then on stage play just really well and consistently well. Like he was the most consistent player in competitive and the least consistent player in practice that I've probably ever seen. But the problem is that the whole game is decided by which of those he is. And it's not just, okay, if he goes 0-10, it's really hard for us to learn because the enemy wins so quickly. It's also if he goes 10-0, it's hard for us to learn because we win too quickly. So having these exploratory days where if we could somehow be really serious individually and then really fun and exploring as a group, but it's impossible to be constantly switching back and forth in the game. So there's so many problems around all this.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like academia has a role in this. Like, eventually we'll have the research to say there are alternative ways that can be used that aren't self-sabotage, and that have benefits in terms of, at the very least, I think we can make the jump from alternative pedagogies, alternative practice methods, and things like well-being. I think we can make that jump sooner rather than later, even if we can't directly link it to performance. And then you're relying on one or two of those G2s or LCK teams who will say, okay, well, we know it's good health and well-being to have some alternatives occasionally. We implement it occasionally, and I can see a world in which that might have an effect one day. Yeah.
This leads me on to another question from Discord, which was, what do you think the future for performance management is? I mean, we kind of been touching on this, but one of the extra follow-ups that this person added on, it's Fabian from Discord, said, like, how can AI maybe help us better support orgs and players? And I mean, with that plus the integration of the API from the game, it could be that these you can find out details about these kind of practices, like how effective is it to not take dragons or something. Maybe we can start to get more robust conclusions quicker. Is that something maybe you see in the future, or where else do you see it kind of going other than the stuff that we've touched on before, which is hopefully just a bit more thinking around why we're doing all the things that we're doing?
Yeah, I guess I have thought about the sort of AI and its training and performance. I've full disclosure, like I feel I embrace. I see real value in competition and training for the experience of competing and training. And so when we talk about things like performance optimization, when we talk about tools to help with that process, sometimes I feel a bit resistant to it, because I'm like, we're in this competitive environment to see what we can achieve and what we can do. Where's the limit in terms of aids to make it easier, or to make it more linear and streamlined, when in fact the rough journey could really be the thing that I do this for. Like, the uncertainty could be the thing that I embrace. So having very sophisticated tools to really show this is what you definitely need to do, this is what you should definitely do less of, I don't naturally lean towards them quite so much, because I think that at some level, your processes as a team, as a group of people, to move yourself forward is so much more satisfying than looking externally to a tool or another sort of analysis. But then, of course, that sounds archaic, because we are in a world where we have all this data. We have infinite statistics and real-time statistics as well. And we have programs now that can help us analyze them. And I think there is a metric out there. One day there'll be a metric out there that will sort of, I think. So AI at the moment is, for me, something that it very much analyzes what's present, and it looks back a little bit, and it integrates statistics from gameplay. There is a level there of, like, there is still a human involved, and that human state is going to fluctuate from practice to practice. So right now you can rely on some analysis from the statistical side thing, and the statistics, and you'd be stupid not to look at it. My understanding is that there's an overwhelming amount. So where do you start with unleashing AI to make sense of it? But I'm a little bit hesitant, and I think that's just reflects poor understanding of what AI is really capable of. How do you see it?
I mean, I think it depends. I think in the right space, I think there's a lot of room for it to be an improvement. I have to say, we're a little bit confused about the whole AI thing in the first place, because there's so many things. The name is now just thrown around for anything.
Right.
So one of the things that jumped to mind when you were saying that, actually, there's two things I'll say. The first one is that I think that making sense of the data, that's where I really see a space for these kind of language models and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't even thinking of language.
Filtering things down a lot more, rather than necessarily doing the analysis. More like you've already got a machine program doing the analysis, and how is that not AI? And the other one is, it doesn't matter. Right. I don't know. But the point is, we've got Bayes, which gets you the API of the game, so you can have something where people are doing tracking and stuff like that. And what tends to happen a lot is some analysts will make an incredibly nice looking system where we get to see a mini map and see where everyone goes, and that's great. And then the first ones you see, the players look at it. The second ones, they look at it a bit. The third ones, they look at it a tiny bit, and then eventually no one's looking at it. Whereas if there was a way to put that extra step of filtering where it could flag up specific warning moments where both junglers came near each other or something like that. Or a thing that comes to mind is that when we're in the LEC, I was doing a lot of exploring of what are things that we could do that other people aren't doing. And one of the companies that I was talking to was doing an automating speech function. So you could leave it in the Discord or whatever, and it would type up what everyone said. The problem with that is it wasn't at the time accurate enough. Again, I don't know how that wasn't AI. We're talking sort of 6-7 years ago, but just because I don't know the technical
Right.
thing, I mean, not that I don't know what it could do. But what I mean is, if you had something like that now, that could also then flag up moments where there was a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Because it can actually tell when there was a piece of information that was said and was clearly not responded to, or wasn't a point of understanding. And so rather than looking at 20 pages of text and looking through it to see how things are, you could just be focused on these specific moments. So I think as tools to enhance very specific areas, I think they could be really great and really exciting. I mean, the other thing, coming from spending a lot of time learning chess as well, the other thing that would be absolutely great is if we could have AIs that eventually give us control of the practice environment, and we play against we scrim the AIs, and we've told the AIs to look at every single game that G2 has done because we're playing them on the weekend and play like G2, and we get to try things out. But the other thing is that when you've seen, I mean, even when you saw stuff like AlphaZero come into chess, the game of chess has changed completely, and the things that they do are quite different. So I'm not a Dota player. There was a time when they did I think it might have even been the same people who made like AlphaZero and stuff like that. They played against the Dota team. There was a lot of problems with how it was all set up, but we'll skip over that. There was a few things that were done that were very different. And the big things that stuck out to me was hitting specific timer windows was like really, really important. So they had a eval bar basically where you ask the AI, what are your chances of winning? And in one game it drafted like a late game composition. And it's like, what are your chances of winning at the beginning of the game? It said like 50, 52%. And then it was like 55%. And then it was like 56%. And then it was like 58%. And then it got to a certain minute and it went from like 61% to 90%. And then it did a fight and then it won the game. It was like, it was just waiting for that moment where hitting that window was like the most important thing. But then there was other little things like buybacks are a thing in Dota, and it used more buybacks than anyone ever.
Yeah.
But we see this in everything, and there's some parts of that translate well, and there's some parts that translate really badly. So in Go, for example, one of the things that AlphaGo did, basically it just doesn't care how much it wins by. It just wants to win. So it plays moves that there was a move at one point where they almost stopped the broadcast because they were like, it's broken. It's broken. Right. It's made an incorrect move, but its eval bar was saying like it's doing better and better. And then in the future, it won by like 2 points or something. I don't know, Go very well. It won by a very small margin. And it turned out that was kind of a crucial move to winning, but no human would ever play that because it would mean you would win by less, and humans want to win by as much as possible. So there's a lot of, and there's stuff in chess where it's like it wants to get the queen out, or it wants to do specific moves where it'll get away with it, but there's no chance any person ever would, there's no chance any person will be able to, this move is the best move as long as you can play the next best 10 subsequent moves. And I think having an AI practice partner would be the most exciting thing. But what's actually, I think, more closely on the horizon is AI to filter out or makes more easy sense of the data that we've got, I think.
Yeah, thanks for putting a few examples on the table. It's like not just deer in the headlights AI. I like the draft tool as well, the draft coach from Jack at Itero Gaming. I think that has a place for facilitating learning at a lower level, perhaps. I'll skip the one about communication just for a moment, but the last one, the point there was in talking to people like Peter Varga, the former Fnatic senior data engineer. He always spoke about, AI and machine learning can help make, with the right data analyst behind the scenes, you can make very complex models quite accessible by coaches to then make more informed decisions. And actually, I'd be a fool not to say we want that, because if the current state of practice is so rigid and it's causing so much frustration and even negative outcomes for so many people, having a means where people can make actually more frequent, more objective-ish decisions, not in terms of like what to do, but what metrics might have real value in your situation of a selection of metrics, and being able to better articulate a plan that people can really buy into and see success with. I think that's probably likely going to improve a lot about well-being, health, and burnout. So I think that's only a good thing. I think my humanistic comment was more related to that use of it in terms of the communication and things like that, like analyzing language and even reading facial displays of emotion. Those tools are only as good as your measurement device, and the measurement devices right now are not there, and that even reflects underlying scientific theory is not there. Like there for a long time, we thought, we were all convinced that there are basic facial displays of emotion. There are 6 basic emotions we all possess and display in our faces. I think surprise, disgust, anger, something like 3 others. And then more recently, there's been work to suggest that we can't agree on that. We can't even find a neural fingerprint to say what's going on in our brains is one certain type of emotions. How on earth can a camera detect it? And then for the AI is working from that data. So I feel like there are human elements that are worth really thinking, do we actually need AI for this? Like, is this really, can we trust this data? Because it comes from measurement tools we've developed that aren't particularly good. And ironically, AI will probably be the thing to help us develop better measurement tools. But certainly for those other 2 areas, making sense of an enormous amount of data, making it more usable, and just putting it into a format that we can better use in our own formula about performance. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. So yeah. But again, it's Peter said it really well when he said it's kind of, data is so integral to esports, and the usage of data is so integral to esports performance. It's really, you need a data engineer and like a data engineer's translator to make sure that it's coming across in the best, most usable way.
Yeah, and the AI could be the translator in the future.
Yeah,
It would be
right.
It's a great space for it, because even I'm even thinking of some of the sort of newer tech stuff that I've seen with these like more accessible kind of eye tracking and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And again, if I was even listening to a talk at the summit about this eye tracking, and I'm always there kind of balancing the practical experience with my theoretical excitement about this thing, and just thinking it's great, but the more difficult thing is, what are you going to do with this data, and how are you going to make it actually accessible to draw some good conclusions?
Yes.
And if there's again, AI fits into that translator thing where we can take, okay, because if you want someone to look through it, you're going to draw very strange conclusions based on the lens that they're looking through it. They're never going to be able to look through that much of it. And if you just say, okay, on the minimap you were watching this % of time, and on the screen you're watching this % of time, because we've just totaled it all up, that's also not very useful, because it completely depends on depends on what's going on. So actually judging that kind of thing, I think, could be really important.
That's one of my biggest criticisms of esports research right now as well. There is a bit of a gold rush, because where things haven't been done, we try and do them. Esports research, case in point, we're seeing lots of papers coming out now to just try and fill a gap. Like, it hasn't been done before. There, I can get publication fairly easily. And things like personality research in esports. Like, what do you want to do with the outcome of that information? Like, we've seen a team try and use personality scores to decide who should be in a certain role on a team. We're nowhere near that yet, but at the same time, do you then want to train people to be a certain type of personality? And like, how does that even compute? Like, I really struggle with that, because ultimately, what are we trying to do here? What do we do with this work? And eye tracking, I do think, has promise. I mean, fascinating to see where your attention is, where your focus is. Pros, like the difference between the sort of the heat map on the screen from eye tracking, differences between professionals and amateur players, fascinating. But what do we do with that? It's what a question.
And also even different professional players. I mean, Faker is a very classic example, who's always doing the F keys, like spamming all over the map. And of course, when you're watching him, it looks even more confusing, because he knows it's coming, so he's ready for the fact that the screen's going to change, whereas you're not. Another sort of silly example that it just reminded me of is that at CES, which just happened, so the Las Vegas, is it, tech conference?
Yeah.
There was a monitor that MSI have made, which has what they're calling, at least, an AI in it, that will give you an indicator when an enemy appears on your minimap. So it'll give you an indicator above your character saying, like, this champion was seen there, so that you have basically perfect map awareness. And the problem is, it's not traceable, because it's happening on the end of the monitor. So, maybe sort of a funny example, but actually with a serious point on the end where, especially with everything being online, what's to stop someone doing this to qualify for the team? What's to stop them doing it all the way till they get a job in the LEC? You can be on online teams until then, and it's like, oh, I just perform a little bit worse on stage because of the nerves, and actually it's because the monitor on stage didn't have your cheat software on, basically. So because I've no idea if this monitor goes into production, what Riot are going to do, because it's literally being advertised so that you can cheat in League of Legends, and there's a huge market for that. And it is incredibly helpful, and it should be not allowed, but how do you ever stop it? So I think there's maybe some dangers on the horizon too.
100%, and far beyond my pay grade. Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of what I was saying about, let's embrace the meaning of what we're doing here. Like, we were playing a video game, we want to get better at it. Let's not cheat ourselves sometimes. But
okay, so we've gone on for a little bit over 2 hours already. So we'll definitely have to do another one of these, as I had sort of 20 questions written down, and we've done one, I think, of what I've gone through. So
we snowballed the one. That's good.
Yeah. So I'm going to end, as I have done with everyone, with some quick fire questions, which for people who haven't seen these before, I'm asking everyone the same thing to just show how different we all are, coming from different backgrounds into esports, as well as they're just interesting things to know. So the first one is, who are the coaches you look up to or idolize, either in esport or sport or from wherever?
Idolize probably none, apart from John Ellis and James Torok Thompson. Shout out to Torok, a huge fan of his. There are some coaches I've learned a lot from, people like Gino Auriemma. He was a coach at women's basketball over in the States. He wrote an autobiography that was very transparent. I wouldn't use his methods, but he had a justification for them. It was quite interesting to read. I read a couple of Phil Jackson books once, and I found them quite a different way of doing things at the highest level. Say idol. In esports, unfortunately, because I can't see behind the scenes so often, I can't always tell. Performance coaches, Ismail over at G2, I think Ismail and Bernadette actually are people that have been quite transparent with their methods and their reasons for doing things. I know it's not game specific, but they've really blazed a trail for a lot of the performance work that's followed. So yeah, those quick answers top of my head.
I think there's also a masterclass by Giro, is it the first guy you mentioned?
Yeah, Gino Auriemma. Yeah.
What's the biggest hardship you've experienced as a coach?
So in sports, I reached a level, all of my 20s and some latter part of my teenage years, I was dead set on becoming a professional basketball coach. I reached a reasonable level in Germany. They call it third league. I would imagine it's actually fourth, but they split the second division into two. So I'm not going to get too big for my boots there. But I reached a decent level. One of the players had aspirations in the German national team. So it was a good level, motivated level. That was honestly, as much as it felt like I was on track, it was honestly one of the most stressful experiences of my life to perform to the level that was expected of players, of the club, whilst at the same time very much seeing myself as in development and not knowing who I could turn to for support. There's also situational factors, like I had to give game reports in German, things like that. That was very challenging. So in terms of me as a coach myself, that was very. In esports, I don't think there's been. I've really, really stuck to this idea of gratitude to be working in gaming, and it never ceases to. It doesn't leave me that when I'm observing a team in scrims, and my job is to think about, are we on the same page? How can we facilitate better understanding? It never ceases. It never leaves me that is an awesome thing. So in esports, I'd say it's been great. Of course, we'd like to have some contracts that extend longer. We'd like to be working with teams for longer, but it hasn't to this point been a huge source of strain for me.
Okay, and what's your top highlight as a coach?
When I first started out in League of Legends, in the UKLC with Lorks from LDN Esports, it was after hours in post-game chat, and this has just come back to me crazy. Well, this is my highlight. But I was talking to the players, and I stumbled on, I forgot the word for a certain in-game, I'm going to say character, and I called them wagon minions. And the whole team, bless them, and obviously it's like, was it Canyon Minion? No, Cannon.
Yeah,
Cannon Minion. The whole team were like equal parts shocked that I didn't know it, having watched them for an entire split, but sympathetic and very, very kind. And I felt like despite me being a bit of a boomer and not having the greatest game knowledge at the time, even now, it was touching to know that I had a place. So that was really great.
Awesome. Okay, what are 3 non-negotiable behaviors that you and people around you need to buy into?
Maybe not non-negotiables, kind of like perspectives on life. Like I think it was an Alan Watts quote, we're under no obligation to be the person we were 5 minutes ago. And therefore we should view people as quite capable of change, but also likely to change. And so we should never be too hard on negative behaviors. And we should be very congratulatory and praising and enthusiastic about positive behaviors, but bearing in mind that it's not a standard that we then hold each other to. There is friction and tension in life, and we change. That's probably something. The social side of performance and social relationships a lot, and it's the hardest thing, I think, when it comes to performance. It's the hardest thing to see, and yet it accounts for so much. Even think that one of the most common phrases is we need to be on the same page, and that's a social process. And because it matters so much, people that I work with, people around me, people I think I want to work more with, are the ones that get that more. And another non-negotiable, I'm really quite flexible and bendy when it comes to these. Try and be decent. Try and honor your commitment to those around you and to your work, to yourself. I think that's probably about it.
Okay. If you from today could give yourself one piece of advice for when you first started coaching, what would that be?
One piece of advice might be, honestly, it sounds very kind of basic, and it's probably for a lack of better ideas right now. It would probably be just do a better job at organizing and tracking what I was doing. So from the get-go in sport, I was making a lot of notes and scribbling in practice plans, scribbling out plays, and I've got boxes of these things that I haven't thrown away upstairs. And now, fast forward to today, I am relentlessly making notes when I'm around a team talking to a coach, and those notes I then make an effort to write up into some sort of spreadsheet that has some sort of coherent dates or whatever, and that has served me very well in terms of providing value, and not just in terms of what I can then talk about in future with teams, but also in terms of just being a bit more certain about my role, because the performance coach role in esports is a little bit ethereal, vague, and it's partly because it's sometimes hard to know which direction to go, because there is so much we could work on. Sometimes it's not apparent what to work on, and if you just keep track and you keep organized, and it sounds really dull, but like if you have evidence you can look at, you can make slightly more informed decisions. So that's probably one piece of advice, and that would have helped me as well. I've done a few qualifications along the way, and I did a residential basketball camp for level 3 advanced basketball coaches. And all I had to do to finish that was submit a season's worth of practice plans. It's been years since I completed the residential camp, which was the hard, expensive part. All I have to do is send them a portfolio of practice plans. And because I didn't do a good enough job of keeping notes, they're all in random folders and I need to spend a couple of days putting them together. So that would have helped. And it's such a random minor thing to say, but that's been used.
No, that's the whole point. I think it's fantastic advice. One of the things that I really want to do with everything that I'm doing is kind of just provide people as much value as I can. So of course, there's some things that just from a time perspective need to be expensive, and there's some things that need to be free. And one of the things that I want to do with this and this question is just give people, not that your answer was boring, but give people boring, practical, actually, this is not like believe in yourself or this kind of thing. This is just like, do keep proper notes because you never know when they might come in handy. I think that's absolutely fantastic piece of advice.
Great. Very pragmatic, very down to earth. Yeah.
Good. So we'll call it there, but definitely have plenty more to discuss. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks for having me, John. This was great fun.